Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku could absorb the last thought of the dying. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The wind on the rooftop was a liar. It whispered of freedom, of open skies and boundless possibilities, a cruel counterpoint to the words that had just hammered the final nails into the coffin of Izuku Midoriya's dream. It's not wrong to dream, All Might said, his skeletal form a stark, disappointing truth against the setting sun. However, you need to be realistic, kid. Each word was a careful, measured blow. Izuku had heard them before, of course. He'd heard them from doctors, from classmates, from the pitying eyes of his own mother. But hearing them from his idol, from the symbol of peace himself, was different. It wasn't a diagnosis or a taunt. It was a final judgment, delivered from the highest court in his world. The dream, a vibrant, sun-drenched tapestry woven since he was 4 years old, withered and turned to ash in his chest. He felt hollow, a fragile shell of a boy standing on a high place. The chain-link fence felt less like a safety barrier and more like the bars of a cage. His yellow backpack, usually a comforting weight, felt like a sack of useless stones. I see, he managed to whisper, his voice a dry rasp. The sound was swallowed by the uncaring wind. All Might sighed, a sound heavy with the weariness of the world. There are other ways to help people. You could be a police officer. They get a bad rap because the villains are always so flashy, but it's a fine profession. He tried for a reassuring smile, but it was a pained, awkward thing on his gaunt face. He gave a final pat on Izuku's shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than a comfort, and turned to the door leading back into the building. Just stay safe. Don't go trying anything foolish. The door clanged shut, leaving Izuku alone with the dying light and the ghost of his future. He stood there for a long time, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple that felt like a mockery. The city below, a sprawling metropolis of dreams and powers, glittered with a million lights, each one a life he would never be able to save. A hero saves people. That was the core of it all, and he, Izuku Midoriya, was not qualified for the job. The descent from the rooftop was a blur. His feet moved on autopilot, carrying his empty body down flights of stairs and out onto the street. The world had lost its color. The cheerful jingles from storefronts were just noise. The laughter of a group of teenagers passing by felt sharp and cruel. He was a ghost haunting his own life, invisible not because of a quirk, but because of a lack of one. To avoid the main thoroughfare, to avoid the possibility of seeing Kaken and his friends, their inevitable sneers and explosive laughter, Izuku took a different route home. A shortcut he usually avoided, a grimy underpass that smelled of damp concrete and neglect. The lights within flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. It was the perfect setting for his mood. A forgotten path for a forgotten boy. He kept his head down, the cracked pavement a landscape of despair. His mind was a maelstrom of failure. Quirkless. Useless. Deku. The names echoed in the hollow space where his dream used to be. He replayed All Might's words, turning them over and over like a smooth, painful stone. Be realistic. It was then that a sound cut through his internal misery. A wet, guttural gasping, followed by a frantic, muffled cry. Izuku's head snapped up. Further down the underpass, partially obscured by a thick concrete support pillar, a struggle was happening. A man, a salaryman in a slightly rumpled suit, his briefcase lying open on the ground with papers spilling out, was engulfed by a monstrous entity. It was a shifting, viscous mass of green-black sludge, a living sewer with 2 huge, manic eyes and a grotesquely wide mouth. The sludge villain. The same one All Might had captured earlier. It must have escaped when he'd grabbed onto the hero's leg. My fault, the thought screamed through him. This is my fault. The man was flailing, his arms and legs churning uselessly within the fluid prison. The villain was forcing itself down his throat, a horrifying act of invasion. The sounds were nightmarish, the wet, sucking noises of the sludge, the choked, desperate pleas of the man, the villain's low, triumphant chuckle that sounded like bubbles popping in filth. Izuku froze, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. His feet were rooted to the spot, cemented by a primal fear that was heavier than any despair he had ever known. His hero notebooks, his years of analysis, his desperate desire to help, all of it evaporated in the face of this raw, immediate terror. The pro-heroes he'd analyzed weren't here. All Might wasn't here. It was just him, a quirkless, useless boy, and a man who was actively, horribly dying. He should run. He should scream for help. He should do something. But his body wouldn't obey. He was a spectator to a snuff film, hidden behind the pillar, his knuckles white where he gripped the strap of his backpack. The man's struggles began to weaken. His thrashing became less frantic, more like a twitch. The gurgling noises quieted. His eyes, wide with a terror that Izuku would never forget, locked onto the spot where Izuku was hiding. For a single, soul-shattering second, their gazes met. There was no accusation in the man's eyes, no plea for help. Just pure, unadulterated panic giving way to a final, awful acceptance. Then, the man went limp. His head lolled to the side, his body hanging slack within the villain's gelatinous form. And that's when it happened. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was a psychic detonation. An invisible, unstoppable wave slammed into Izuku's mind, originating from the now still form of the salaryman. It bypassed his ears, his eyes, his skin, and struck the very core of his consciousness. Agony. First came the sensation. It was not a memory of a feeling. It was the feeling itself, superimposed over his own reality. His own lungs, which had been drawing the damp air of the underpass, were suddenly, impossibly, full. Not with air, but with a thick, cloying, suffocating fluid. It burned. It was a searing, cold fire that clawed at his alveoli. He could feel it in his throat, a thick plug of slime he couldn't dislodge. Panic, hotter and sharper than anything he had ever known, seized him. His own limbs, still frozen behind the pillar, felt like they were flailing, kicking, fighting against an unbeatable tide, the phantom muscles screaming with exertion and oxygen debt. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, but it wasn't the dim light of the underpass. It was an absolute, final blackness, the shutting down of a brain starved of life. The phantom sound of his own, the man's, heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of terror that grew slower, and slower, and then stopped. The silence that followed was more profound than the absence of sound. It was the absence of life. He felt the precipice, the horrifying lurch of tipping over from being to not being. And in that final, infinitesimal moment before the void, a thought pierced the storm. It was not a scream. It was not a prayer. It was a whisper, clear as a bell in the screaming chaos of his mind, imbued with a weight of sorrow so immense it buckled his knees. I forgot to pick up the milk for her breakfast. The thought was not his own, yet he understood it with an intimacy that was terrifying. It was laced with a sudden, gut-wrenching spike of regret, a love so mundane and so powerful it was like a star collapsing into a singularity. With the thought came a memory, vivid and complete. It bloomed behind his eyes, a perfect, stolen jewel of a moment. A brightly lit kitchen, smelling of toast and coffee. Sunlight streamed through a clean window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. A little girl, no older than 5, sat at a small wooden table. She wore pink pajamas decorated with cartoon bunnies, and her dark hair was a messy halo around her head. She giggled, a sound like tiny silver bells, as she pushed a piece of toast into her mouth, a smear of jam on her cheek. The love the man felt for this child, his child, was a physical warmth that filled Izuku's chest, a radiant, overwhelming wave of pure paternal affection. He knew, with an impossible certainty, that her name was Akari. He knew she loved her cereal with exactly 2 spoonfuls of sugar. He knew her favorite bunny on her pajamas was the one with the floppy ear. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it was all gone. The psychic wave receded, leaving a vacuum in its wake. The world crashed back into Izuku. The cold, hard reality of the concrete pillar against his back. The acrid smell of the underpass. The sight of the sludge villain, now casually oozing away from the discarded body, muttering to itself. Heh! A perfect meat shield. Now to find a stronger one. The whiplash was too much. The phantom sensation of drowning, the agonizing regret, the blindingly pure love of a father for his daughter, It all slammed against the wall of his own teenage despair. His stomach revolted. He stumbled away from the pillar, collapsing onto his hands and knees, and vomited onto the grimy pavement. A wretched, heaving expulsion that did nothing to purge the horror that had taken root in his soul. His own breath came in ragged, panicked sobs. He gasped for air, his lungs burning not from sludge but from the memory of it. He could still feel the ghost of the man's final moments, a cold, dead weight inside him. The memory of the little girl, Akari, was seared into his brain, as clear and sharp as any memory of his own mother. He heard distant sirens. Someone must have called it in. A pair of paramedics in crisp uniforms came jogging down the underpass ramp, their medical kit rattling. They saw him first, a boy on his hands and knees shaking uncontrollably. "Hey! Kid! Are you okay?" One of them called out, kneeling beside him. Izuku couldn't answer. He could only shake his head, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked past the paramedic, at the still form of the salaryman lying a dozen meters away. A life. A person. A father. Gone. "Looks like he's in shock," the second paramedic said, already moving toward the victim. "Saw the whole thing, probably." "Easy, son," the first one said, his voice gentle but professional. "Just breathe. You're safe now." Safe? The word was meaningless. He wasn't physically harmed, but he felt like a part of his soul had been scooped out and replaced with a shard of someone else's dying moment. He was vaguely aware of being helped to his feet, of a blanket being draped over his shoulders. His mind was a fractured mess. He couldn't process their questions. "Did you see where the villain went? Did you see his face?" All he could see was a little girl with a jam-smeared smile, waiting for a father who would never come home, for a carton of milk that would never be bought. Then, a new sound. Explosions. A familiar, angry roar. "Kaken?" The paramedic stiffened. "Control, we've got a second incident. Sounds like the same perpetrator, main shopping district, 2 blocks east." Izuku's head snapped in the direction of the sound. Through the haze of his trauma, a new horror bloomed. The villain had found its stronger host. He didn't know why he ran. Maybe it was the ingrained instinct of a hero fanboy. Maybe it was a desperate, primal need to prevent it from happening again, to stop that psychic wave of death from hitting him a second time. He shrugged off the blanket and bolted, leaving the confused paramedic shouting behind him. He burst out of the underpass and into a scene of chaos. A crowd was gathered, phones held aloft, a wall of gawking spectators. Pro-heroes, Kamui Woods, Death Arms, Backdraft, were on the scene, but they were struggling. And there, in the center of the inferno he had caused, was the sludge villain, larger and more menacing than before. And trapped within it, explosions popping uselessly from his hands, was Katsuki Bakugo. Kaken's eyes were wide with a mix of fury and genuine fear. He was drowning, just like the salaryman. Izuku saw it all through a new, terrifying lens. He didn't just see a villain attack. He saw a life clock ticking down. He saw the potential for another psychic death blow that he knew, with bone-deep certainty, would shatter what was left of his mind. He saw Death Arms get knocked back. He saw Empty Lady unable to fit in the narrow street. He saw the heroes hesitating, waiting for someone with the right quirk. And he saw Kaken's eyes, pleading for a rescue he was too proud to ask for. Before he knew what he was doing, his legs were moving. He burst through the crowd, his useless yellow backpack bouncing on his shoulders. The heroes yelled at him. "Stop! It's too dangerous! You'll get yourself killed." The word resonated with the fresh horror of the man's death. He wasn't running to be a hero. He was running away from being a witness. The only way to stop the echo was to stop the death. He threw his backpack, the desperate, foolish act of a quirkless child. It struck the villain in the eye, startling it for a precious second. He clawed at the sludge, his fingers finding no purchase. "Deku! What the hell are you doing here?" Bakugo roared, his voice strained. "My legs just started moving!" Izuku screamed, tears of terror and frustration streaming down his face. "I couldn't just stand there and watch you die." "I couldn't bear to feel it," his mind shrieked. Not again. He looked at Bakugo, and for a moment he saw the man from the underpass. He saw a life on the brink. The grim determination on his face was not born of courage, but of a unique and terrible trauma. Then, a thunderous boom. "I am here!" The voice was a physical force, scattering the smoke and fear. All Might, in his magnificent muscle form, had arrived. The crowd roared with a relief so profound it was a single, unified sigh. But for Izuku, the awe was tainted. He saw his hero, the pinnacle of power, and thought only one thing: you're too late. You saved one. But you weren't there for the other. All Might dispatched the villain with an almost casual display of overwhelming power. A Detroit smash that changed the weather, bringing rain down to douse the flames. In the aftermath, Izuku was scolded by the pro-heroes. Bakugo was praised for his tenacity. Izuku stood there, numb, soaked by the rain, the blanket from the paramedic now a sodden weight. He felt utterly, completely alone. He had started his walk home again, his mind a quiet, desolate landscape, when the voice called out to him. "I am here!" "To find you, young man." All Might skidded to a halt before him, steam rising from his body. He reverted to his true form with a puff of smoke, a trickle of blood at his mouth. He praised Izuku. He told him that he, too, had been scared on the scene. That his body had moved before he could think. "You young man," All Might said, his voice imbued with a new, powerful sincerity. "You ran in when the top heroes hesitated. You acted. In you, I saw the spirit of a true hero." Izuku looked up, his eyes empty. The words that would have been a divine chorus to him just hours before now felt hollow. A true hero? He had run because he was terrified. He had run to save himself from a psychic curse he didn't understand. Then came the words that changed everything, again. "You can become a hero." Tears welled in Izuku's eyes, but they were not tears of pure joy. They were tears of relief, of sorrow, of terror. The world snapped back into focus, but it was a darker, sharper world. All Might's words weren't just permission. They were a mandate. A sacred, terrifying duty. He had to become a hero. He had to get strong enough, fast enough, smart enough to make sure no one ever died in front of him again. Because now he knew the price of failure. It wasn't just a lost life. It was a new ghost to carry, a new death to experience. All Might explained the nature of his quirk, one for all. A sacred torch passed down through generations. A crystallization of power. He was offering Izuku a chance, a legacy. Izuku looked at the hero, the number one, the man who held the power to save everyone. And he thought of the salaryman, dead in a forgotten underpass. He thought of Akari, who would be setting the table for one less person tomorrow. All Might was powerful, but he wasn't omniscient. He couldn't be everywhere. "I'll do it," Izuku said. His voice didn't crack. It was low, steady, and filled with a grim determination that startled even All Might. There was no giddy excitement, no fanbush squeal. There was only the dead serious resolve of a boy who had looked into the abyss, and had the abyss stare back. He would take this power. He would master it, not just to save people, but to save himself from the echoes of the lost. That night, back in the safety of his room, the world felt wrong. The All Might posters on his wall seemed to mock him, relics of a naive childhood that had been brutally murdered that afternoon. His mother had fussed over him, relieved he was safe, but he couldn't meet her eyes. How could he explain the shadow he saw lurking behind them, the potential for a final thought he could never bear to hear? He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in an endless loop. The sludge. Bakugo's face. All Might's shining smile. But they were all background noise. The main feature, playing on a constant, torturous loop, was the memory that was not his own, the bright kitchen. The smell of toast. The giggle of a little girl in bunny pajamas. Akari. He squeezed his eyes shut, but he could still see her. He could still feel the phantom sensation of drowning, the cold grip of death. He could still hear that final, heartbreakingly simple thought. "I forgot to pick up the milk for her breakfast." It was then, in the suffocating silence of his bedroom, that the full, horrifying truth dawned on him. This wasn't a one-time psychic fluke. It wasn't a side effect of shock. He had been born quirkless, everyone had said. They were wrong. He had a quirk. A quirk that only activated in the presence of death. A quirk that burdened him with the final, most intimate moments of the dying. A curse disguised as a power. He was Izuku Midoriya. And he was a walking graveyard. The next 10 months were a crucible, forging Izuku Midoriya's body and fracturing his soul in equal measure. On the surface, his life followed the script written by All Might. The American Dream Plan was his Bible, the sands of Dagoba Municipal Beach Park his temple. Every sunrise found him there, a lone figure against the silhouette of trash mountains, the salty air thick with the smell of rust and decay. All Might, in his skeletal form, would watch from a rusted-out car, offering encouragement and dietary advice. "You've got to build your body into a proper vessel, my boy. More protein. Less hesitation," he'd call out, his voice a reedy but cheerful command. He saw a dedicated student, a boy with a fire in his belly, pushing himself past every conceivable limit. He saw the sweat, the grit, the rapidly developing muscles. He saw a dream being painstakingly rebuilt. He didn't see the ghosts. He didn't see the shadow of Kenji Tanaka, the salaryman, that clung to Izuku like a second skin. He didn't know that every time Izuku hauled a waterlogged refrigerator, his lungs would phantom burn with the memory of drowning. He didn't know that the motivation driving Izuku wasn't just the bright, shining goal of becoming a hero, but a dark, frantic flight from the horror he'd experienced. He was building a fortress of muscle, not just to wield one for all, but to withstand the next psychic deathblow. The first few weeks were a quiet agony. He was hypervigilant, his head on a constant swivel. Every siren, every raised voice, every sudden braking of a car sent a spike of ice-cold dread through him. He lived in fear of the next unwanted echo. He chose his routes with paranoid care, avoiding dense crowds and deserted alleyways, creating a small, safe bubble for himself between home, school, and the beach. The first time it happened again, it was almost gentle, a cruel subversion of his expectations. He was 2 months into his training, taking a 5-minute break. His muscles screamed, his palms were raw, but he'd managed to clear a small patch of beach, revealing a strip of clean, pale sand. He sat on an overturned washing machine, catching his breath, and looked out over the cityscape that bordered the coast. His gaze drifted across the rows of mundane apartment buildings, their windows like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Suddenly, a wave of peace washed over him. It wasn't violent like the last one. There was no pain, no panic. It was a soft, gentle fading, like a candle flame being calmly snuffed out. His own frantic pulse seemed to slow, his ragged breathing easing into a long, slow exhale he didn't initiate. He felt a profound weariness, the satisfying ache of a long life fully lived, and then, a sense of release. A heavy burden being set down. A thought, clear and serene, bloomed in his mind. It was laced with a love that had aged like fine wine, mellowed over decades of longing. "Finally, I can see you again, my love." The accompanying memory was not a vibrant scene, but a single, static image. A black and white photograph, curled at the edges, held in aged, wrinkled hands. It was a portrait of a young woman with a kind smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. She wore the fashion of a bygone era. Izuku didn't know her, but he felt the man's love for her as if it were a sun warming his own chest. He felt the vast, lonely expanse of the years spent without her, and the final, quiet joy of their impending reunion. The sensation passed, leaving Izuku sitting on the washing machine, the sea breeze cold on his sweat-dampened skin. He didn't vomit this time. He just sat, his heart aching with a borrowed grief and a borrowed relief. It was beautiful, in a way. A peaceful end. But it was an intrusion of the highest order. He had been a silent, unwilling guest at the most private moment of a stranger's life. He had stolen a man's reunion with his wife. The finality of it all struck him. Kenji Tanaka wasn't a fluke. This was his life now. He was a receiver for the city's last goodbyes. That night, he couldn't sleep. The two echoes, the violent and the peaceful, warred in his head. The terror of drowning versus the calm of release. The regret for a forgotten carton of milk versus the joy of a promised reunion. They were not his memories, but they were taking up residence in his mind, threatening to crowd out his own experiences. He felt like a haunted house, new ghosts taking up rooms without his permission. He needed a way to contain them. He got out of bed and went to his desk. He pushed aside his hero analysis notebooks, their pages filled with the naive enthusiasm of a boy he no longer was. He took out a fresh notebook, a plain black one he'd bought for a class he'd forgotten. He opened it to the first page. For a long moment, he just stared at the blank, lined paper. Then, his pen began to move. He couldn't write down his quirk. He couldn't write "I absorb dying thoughts." It was too monstrous. Instead, he gave the notebook a title, a name that felt both solemn and fitting: Memento Mori. Remember, you must die. Below it, he began the first entry. He'd spent hours online over the past weeks, cross-referencing the date, time, and location of the sludge villain attack with local news reports. He'd found him. Entry 1. Name: Kenji Tanaka. Age 42. Cause: villain attack, sludge villain. Sensation: suffocation. Panic. Overwhelming terror. Last thought: I forgot to pick up the milk for her breakfast. Memory: a daughter, Akari, maybe 5 years old. Kitchen table. Jam on her cheek. An immense, powerful feeling of love and sudden, soul-crushing regret. His handwriting was shaky. Putting the words on the page made it real in a way it hadn't been before. It was no longer just a traumatic memory, it was data. An entry in a ledger. He felt a sliver of control, a grim sense of order being imposed on the chaos in his head. This notebook would not be for analysis. It would be a memorial. A private, secret place to lay his ghosts to rest. He turned to the next page. Entry 2. Name: unknown. Elderly man. Cause: natural causes presumed. Sensation: a slow, peaceful fading. Release: no pain. Last thought: finally, I can see you again, my love. Memory: a black and white photo of a young woman. The feeling of decades of love and profound loneliness, ending in peace. The anonymity of it gnawed at him. He had this man's most intimate moment, but he didn't have a name. It felt like a failure. He made a silent vow. He would remember them all, named or not. He would be their witness. The creation of the notebook was a turning point. It didn't stop the echoes, but it gave him a process. It was his coping mechanism, his grim ritual. And it changed the way he saw the world. 4 months into his training, it happened again. This time, the echo brought with it a venom that poisoned his worldview. He was jogging home, long after sunset, his body a symphony of aches. The American dream plan was relentless. He took a shortcut through a poorly lit commercial district, the silence broken only by the sound of his own footfalls. A scream. Sharp and high, cut off abruptly from a dark alleyway to his left. Izuku froze, his blood running cold. No, no, no. He was within range. He knew it instantly. The psychic static was already building at the edges of his perception. He braced himself. The wave hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't the suffocating pressure of drowning, or the gentle fading of old age. This was a bolt of pure, white-hot agony. A sharp, searing pain exploded in his own side, so real he gasped and stumbled, clutching at his ribs. He felt the phantom wetness of blood, the shocking cold of steel, the horrifying sensation of his own life spilling out onto grimy asphalt. The world tilted, his legs giving out from under him, mimicking the collapse of a body he couldn't see. With the pain came a thought, not of sorrow or peace, but of pure, undiluted rage. Not like this! He can't get away with this! It was a furious, desperate denial. The sheer injustice of it burned through Izuku's mind, a borrowed fury that made his own teeth grind. And then came the memory. It wasn't a fond recollection, it was a flash-frame image from the victim's dying eyes. A man's face, illuminated for a split second by a flickering overhead streetlight. He was young, with a cruel, sneering smile and a jagged scar that ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheek. The image was burned into Izuku's brain with perfect, photographic clarity. The sensation vanished, leaving Izuku on one knee on the pavement, gasping, his own side throbbing with phantom pain. The rage was still there, a hot coil in his gut. It was the victim's dying wish, a curse laid upon his killer. He can't get away with this. Driven by that borrowed fury, Izuku scrambled to his feet. He peeked cautiously around the corner of the alley. A figure was sprinting away down the other end, a silhouette against the distant glow of the main street. As the figure passed under another light, he turned his head for a brief moment. It was the face from the memory. The sneer. The scar. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. This was different. This wasn't just a sorrow to be recorded. This was actionable intelligence. The victim's last thought wasn't a lament, it was a mandate. An order. He thought about calling the police. He imagined the conversation. Hello? I'd like to report a murder. How do I know who did it? Oh, the victim's ghost told me. They'd lock him in a psychiatric ward. He was a 15-year-old boy. Quirkless, as far as the world knew. He had no credibility. He was powerless. No. Not powerless. Not anymore. That night, his hands shook as he opened the memento's notebook. The entry was chillingly precise. Entry 3. Name unknown. Mugging victim? Cause homicide. Stab wound left side. Sensation sharp, severe pain. Shock. Rapid blood loss. Last thought. Not like this. He can't get away with this. Memory, the killer's face. Below the text, he took out a pencil. His skills, honed by years of drawing heroes in his analysis notebooks, had a new, grim purpose. With steady, practiced strokes, he recreated the face from the memory, the sneering lips, the cold eyes, the jagged scar. It was a perfect police sketch. He stared at the drawing. The notebook was no longer just a memorial. It was an intel file. A database of last moments and final secrets. His quirk wasn't just a curse that brought him pain. It was a tool, a dark, terrible tool. This realization changed his training. The next day, All Might saw a new intensity in the boy. When Izuku lifted a rusted engine block, his grunt of exertion was closer to a roar of rage. When he ran his sprints, he ran with the desperation of a man fleeing a murderer. He was channeling the ghosts now. He used the quiet peace of the old man to find his center. He used the fury of the mugging victim to fuel his strength. He used the heartbreaking regret of Kenji Tanaka to remind him of the stakes. The echoes kept coming. The city was a symphony of death, and he was its unwilling conductor. 6 months in. He was on a crowded street, doing a mandated cool-down run. The screech of tires, a sickening crunch of metal and bone. A car had jumped the curb. It happened 20 feet away. The wave hit him before the screams of the crowd. It was a woman. The sensation was a nauseating, tumbling chaos. Blunt force trauma. The horrifying, instant snap of a spine. The world spinning, then darkness. Her last thought wasn't for herself. It was a single, raw, primal scream of a name filled with a mother's fierce, all-encompassing love. Yuki! The memory was of a little boy with bright, laughing eyes soaring high on a park swing, his hair catching the afternoon sun. Izuku collapsed on the sidewalk, his own name lost in the cacophony of panicked shouts from the onlookers. A kind stranger helped him up, assuming he was in shock from witnessing the accident. It's okay, kid, just breathe. But Izuku was choking on a grief that wasn't his. He added another entry to his book that night, his pen scratching angrily at the page. There was no villain to blame here, no killer to hunt. Just the cruel, senseless randomness of fate. A driver distracted for a single second, a life extinguished, a boy named Yuki left motherless. It taught him a new, chilling lesson: not every monster could be punched. By the 10th month, the transformation was complete. The memento's notebook was thick, nearly half full. It was a library of sorrows, a grim catalogue of the city's quiet tragedies. A teenager who overdosed in a dirty bathroom, his last thought a muddled, confused whimper for his mom. A construction worker who fell from a high-rise, his last thought a flash of terror, and the image of his wife's face. A victim of a house fire, the searing heat and a desperate, prayerful apology to the family they couldn't save. Each one left a new scar on his soul, but each one also added a new book to his mental library. He began to understand the city in a way no hero ever could. He understood the desperation that drove a man to steal, the blind loyalty that made someone follow a charismatic villain, the simple, everyday fears of the civilians he swore to protect. He understood the texture of death in all its forms, violent, peaceful, tragic, and mundane. His training with All Might became unnervingly insightful. "All right, young Midoriya," All Might said one evening, as the sun set over a nearly clean beach. "Hypothetical. A villain with a teleportation quirk has taken a hostage in a bank. How do you approach?" The old Izuku would have mumbled about hero matchups and collateral damage. The new Izuku's eyes went distant for a moment. He was accessing the library. He remembered the last thought of a bank robber shot by police 2 months prior. The back exit. I should have used the back exit. He remembered the flash of panic from a security guard who had a heart attack during a different holdup. My daughter's recital is tonight. I can't die. You don't focus on the villain first, Izuku said, his voice quiet and steady. You focus on the environment. The villain is desperate. Teleportation is usually a flight quirk, not a fight quirk. He's cornered. The hostage is the only leverage. But the hostage isn't just a bargaining chip, they're a person. Their panic is the villain's biggest weakness and their biggest danger. You need to de-escalate. Create a perimeter not to trap the villain, but to give him a perceived out. Make him think he has an escape route you can control. Address the hostage directly, calmly. Give them a focal point other than their captor. The villain's desperation is a fire, don't throw gasoline on it. Suffocate it. All Might stared, his jaw slightly slack. The analysis was brilliant. It was nuanced, empathetic, and strategically sound, far beyond what he would expect from a teenager. That's remarkably insightful, my boy. You really have been studying. Izuku just nodded, his gaze fixed on the last mountain of trash he had yet to move. Studying doesn't even begin to cover it, he thought, the ghosts whispering their agreement in the back of his mind. The day before the UA entrance exam, he stood alone in his room. He had done it. Dagoba Beach was pristine, its sands gleaming under the moonlight. His body was a testament to his labor, a lean, hardened physique, corded with the muscle needed to inherit a supernova. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of his window. The wide, teary eyes of the boy who had met All Might on a rooftop were gone. In their place were the eyes of a 15-year-old who looked ancient. They were calm, heavy, and held the weight of dozens of lives and dozens of deaths. He opened his mementos notebook. He flipped through the pages, a litany of pain and loss. Kenji Tanaka. The scarred mugger. The mother of Yuki. The teenager. The construction worker. Names and faces, known and unknown. A community of the dead resided within him, a silent council that had educated him in the harsh realities of the world. He closed the book. Tomorrow, he would walk into the UA entrance exam. He felt no excitement, no flutter of nervous anticipation. That was a luxury for the other children, the ones who still saw heroism as a bright and shining cape. For Izuku Midoriya, it was not a dream to be chased. It was a war to be won. He had to succeed. He had to gain the power and the position to stop more names from being added to his library. He was the only librarian, and the ghosts were demanding silence. The dream, once a fragile, broken thing, had been given a second life. Izuku Midoriya was a student at UA High, the most prestigious hero academy in Japan. He walked the hallowed halls, sat in the same classrooms as heroes in training, and wore the same crisp uniform as his classmates. He had friends, kind, earnest Achiko Uraraka and rigidly noble Tenya Ida. He even had a grudging, explosive rival in Kaken. On the surface, it was everything he had ever wanted, but beneath the surface, the ghosts were restless. His quirk, his curse, had transformed the hallowed halls into a minefield of potential grief. He couldn't fully relax, couldn't surrender to the simple joys of high school life. A part of his mind was always on standby, a sensitive psychic instrument tuned to the frequency of death. The city of Muzutafu, a vibrant metropolis to his peers, was to him a sprawling, invisible cemetery, and he was its unwilling groundskeeper. He'd had 2 more echoes since the exam, a quiet passing in a hospital he jogged past, and a tragic, sudden brain aneurysm from a man in a coffee shop. Both were added to the grim ledger in his memento mori notebook, now hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his room. Each entry made him wiser, and each entry chipped away another piece of the boy he used to be. The bus ride to the unforeseen simulation joint, or USJ, was a perfect illustration of his new reality. The air buzzed with the bright, nervous energy of Class 1A. I say whatever's on my mind. My name's Tsuyu Ajiri, but please call me Tsu. Your quirk is a lot like All Might's, Kirishima exclaimed, his sharp-toothed grin aimed at Izuku. It's super flashy and powerful. Not like my hardening. It's strong, but doesn't get a lot of glory. Izuku managed a shaky smile, his hand instinctively going to his scarred finger. Oh, well, I'm still getting the hang of it. It's pretty hard to control. He participated in the banter, but his heart wasn't in it. While his friends debated the finer points of heroism and flashy quirks, Izuku's senses were stretched thin. He found himself listening past their cheerful voices, scanning the faces of drivers in other cars, his eyes flicking to the rooftops of buildings they passed. He was subconsciously mapping his proximity to the thousands of lives around them, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety thrumming just beneath his skin. The fear of another echo was a constant companion. When they arrived at the massive domed facility and were greeted by the space hero, 13, the thematic weight of the day settled on Izuku's shoulders like a lead blanket. My quirk, Black Hole, can suck up and turn anything to dust, 13 explained, her suited form gesturing grandly. It's a power that can easily be used to kill. I'm sure some of you have similar abilities. A murmur went through the class. Izuku's blood ran cold. He thought of the library of sorrows in his head, the victims of villains, accidents, and random fate. This class is to show you how to use your quirks to save lives, 13 continued, her voice resonating with passion. You are not here to learn how to fight, but to rescue. To help. Because a hero's power, when used incorrectly, can be a terrifying thing. The words struck Izuku with the force of a physical blow. He understood them on a level no one else in the dome possibly could. He had felt the terrifying end that such power could bring. His mission, his grim mandate, was being echoed back at him by one of his teachers. He had to learn. He had to master one for all, not just to be a symbol of peace, but to be a bulwark against the tide of final whispers that threatened to drown him. As Aizawa was about to begin the lesson, the lights in the facility flickered and died. The central water fountain sputtered. A strange, unnatural feeling prickled at the back of Izuku's neck, the psychic static he had come to dread. It was faint, but it was there. A feeling of malice, cold and sharp, radiating from the plaza below. A swirling vortex of purple-black mist bloomed in the center of the USJ. It wasn't like 13's quirk. This felt oily, wrong. From its depths, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. Riff-raff, thugs, and monsters, their eyes glinting with malicious intent. And then two figures of particular note. One was a man made entirely of the dark mist, dressed in a sharp suit, his eyes two glowing yellow slits. The other was slender, covered in disembodied hands that gripped his arms, his neck, his face. He walked with a slouching, jerky gait, scratching furiously at his neck. Stay back! Aizawa commanded, his capture weapon unfurling and his goggles slipping over his eyes. This is real. Those are villains. The panic that erupted among his classmates was a normal, healthy reaction. For Izuku, it was different. The collective malice of the invaders was a low, humming wave of psychic noise, grating on his senses. But underneath it, he could feel the individual threads of fear, desperation, and bloodlust. It was a prelude to the cacophony he knew was coming. Aizawa leaped into battle, a whirlwind of motion and skill. He was a master of his craft, nullifying quirks and using his capture weapon with brutal efficiency. He was a force of nature, taking down villain after villain. Izuku watched, his hero analysis mind working, but another part of him, the part that housed his curse, was braced for impact. It happened near the landslide zone. A large, brutish villain with a rock exoskeleton quirk charged Aizawa. Aizawa, having just engaged another foe, dodged with fluid grace. The rock villain's powerful, haymaker punch missed him completely and, with a sickening crunch, connected with the head of a much smaller, skinnier villain standing behind him. The psychic wave hit Izuku like a freight train. It wasn't a major death. It wasn't a heroic sacrifice. It was a pathetic, meaningless end. The sensation was one of sudden, shocking impact. The feeling of his own skull, the man's skull, shattering like porcelain. A brief, explosive flash of white pain, then a dizzying, lurching darkness. There was no time for fear, only a split second of stunned surprise. Then the thought, soaked in a bitter, hopeless desperation. I just needed the money, she said the medicine was. The thought cut off as consciousness winked out, but the memory that accompanied it was complete. A cramped, dimly lit apartment. A small, frail woman, presumably the man's mother, coughing into a handkerchief. The memory was saturated with a feeling of helpless inadequacy, the crushing weight of poverty, and the foolish, desperate hope that this one high-risk job would solve everything. Izuku staggered, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. His vision swam. The vibrant colors of the USJ seemed to gray out for a moment. Midoriya? You alright, man? Kirishima asked from beside him, his hand hovering near Izuku's shoulder. I'm fine. Izuku choked out, forcing himself to stand straight. Just the shock of seeing it, it's so real. He used the truth as a shield for the deeper, more horrifying truth. He hadn't just seen it, he had felt it. His mind was already filing it away, another name, or lack thereof, to be entered into his mental mementos. Entry 37. Unknown. Desperate. Killed by his own side, the man made of mist, Kurojiri, moved to block their escape. It is a pleasure to meet you. We are the League of Villains. And we are here to kill All Might. Before they could react, his misty form expanded, engulfing them. The world became a swirling vortex of purple and black. Izuku felt the horrifying sensation of being pulled apart and reassembled. He landed with a splash in cold water, the shock of it a terrifying echo of Kenji Tanaka's drowning. He surfaced, sputtering, alongside Tsuyu and a screaming Mineta. They were in the shipwreck zone, surrounded by villains with aquatic and heteromorphic quirks. Panic gave way to a cold, hard focus. This was no longer a training exercise, it was a survival scenario. The whispers of the dead, however, gave him an edge. He understood desperation. He understood the mindset of the low-level thug who was in over his head. These villains weren't masterminds. They were sharks smelling blood, overconfident and likely uncoordinated. They don't know our quirks. Izuku realized aloud, his mind racing, piecing together a plan. He looked at Tsuyu, at Mineta's sticky balls. We have the element of surprise. If we work together, his plan was a stroke of desperate genius, using Mineta's quirk to create a vortex that neutralized the villains. It worked. They had survived the first wave, but as they made their way to the central plaza, the true horror of the situation became apparent. Aizawa was down. Their teacher, their first line of defense, was pinned beneath the hulking form of a monstrous creature with dark skin, an exposed brain, and dead, staring eyes. The Nomu, the man covered in hands, Shigaraki, stood over him, one hand scratching his neck, the other reaching for Aizawa's face. You're so cool, Eraserhead, Shigaraki said, his voice a petulant, grating whine. But you're no match for my Noma. They watched in horror as the Nomu brutally slammed Aizawa's head into the concrete. Izuku felt a surge of rage and fear, but his own psychic senses were screaming a different kind of warning. The ambient malice in the dome was congealing, focusing around Shigaraki. It was a hungry, nihilistic void. Shigaraki's attention turned to the three students. His red eyes, visible through the gaps in the hand on his face, fixed on Tsuyu. Let's finish this level and wait for the final boss. He moved with a horrifying, unnatural speed, his hand outstretched, 5 fingers ready to destroy. Time seemed to slow down. Izuku saw the trajectory, the intent. He saw Tsuyu's wide, terrified eyes. He wouldn't be a witness again. Not this time. Get away from her! He roared, launching himself forward, arm cocked back, the red veins of one for all racing up his skin. He wouldn't make it in time to land a punch, but he could intercept. He could shove her out of the way. But as he moved, so did someone else. One of the minor villains from the shipwreck zone, a sycophant with a weak waterjet quirk, had recovered and scrambled up onto the plaza, hoping to impress the leader. I'll get her for you, Shigaraki! The villain cried, lurching forward. Shigaraki, his focus entirely on Tsuyu, didn't even seem to notice. His hand, aimed for Tsuya's face, moved through the space where the minor villain was foolishly trying to cut across. The tips of Shigaraki's fingers brushed against the villain's forearm, and Izuku felt it. There was no impact. No pain. No heat or cold. It wasn't a wave of sensation that slammed into him. It was a wave of nothing. A psychic black hole opened and closed in the space of a nanosecond. The part of his mind that was connected to the dying villain simply ceased to exist. There was no final thought, no memory, no sensation of passing. There was only a sudden, violent, and absolute erasure. It was the feeling of a line of code being deleted from reality, the sensation of a soul being unwritten from the book of existence. It was the purest form of oblivion he could possibly imagine, and it was 1,000 times more terrifying than the most painful death. The psychic shock was so profound, so utterly alien, that Izuku's forward momentum died. He collapsed to his knees a few feet away, his mind reeling from the contact with pure non-existence. The power of One for All fizzled out, leaving his arm trembling. He stared at the spot where the villain had been. There was only a scattering of gray dust, drifting away on a non-existent breeze. Shigaraki clicked his tongue in annoyance, his attack on Tsuya thwarted by the fool's interruption and Izuku's charge. TCH. Glitches. I hate glitches. But then, the doors to the USJ burst open with a resounding boom. All Might stood there, not smiling. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. Have no fear, students, he boomed, his voice shaking the very foundations of the dome. I am here. The battle that followed was legendary. All Might versus the Noma. It was a clash of titans, a storm of blows that shook the air. But All Might was at a disadvantage. He was running on fumes, and the Noma's shock absorption quirk was negating his most powerful attacks. Izuku watched, his mind still reeling from the echo of decay. He understood Shigaraki now. It wasn't just a desire to destroy. It was a power that embodied nothingness. The man was a walking, talking void. The Noma was his tool, a bioengineered puppet of immense strength. A puppet. The word snagged in his mind. All Might was locked in a grapple with the creature, his strength being pushed to its absolute limit. The other villains were a chaotic mess, some fighting Bakugo and Kirishima, others cowering. One of them, a man in a tattered lab coat who had been shouting orders at the Noma earlier, had been caught in the shockwave of All Might's arrival. He was pinned under a huge slab of concrete from a destroyed statue, bleeding out, his breathing shallow. He was within range. Izuku felt the life fading from him, and braced himself. The wave came. It was a messy, painful one. The feeling of being crushed, of ribs piercing lungs. A gurgling, wet sensation. The man was drowning in his own blood. His final thoughts were not of loyalty or ideology, but of frantic, scientific frustration. A lifetime of work, failing at the final hurdle. Wrong, the stabilization fluid, unstable under repeated high-frequency impact. The cranial casing couldn't shield it all. Brain is exposed, always weakest from the back. The processors, vulnerable from the back. The thought was a jumbled, desperate string of technical data, a scientist's last lament. But to Izuku, it was a key. A schematic. A glaring weakness in the monster that was about to kill the symbol of peace. The brain is exposed. Weak from the back. He had to tell him. He couldn't just scream it. No one would hear him over the din of battle. He had to create an opening. Fueled by a dead man's regret, Izuku pushed himself to his feet. He saw Bakugo pinning Kurojiri, Kirishima trying to land a blow on Shigaraki. He had one shot. Get out of the way! He screamed, channeling One for All into his legs. He burst forward, not at the Nomu, but at an angle, flanking it. He jumped, using a piece of debris as a launch pad, putting himself directly in the Namtest line of sight, but away from All Might. DKU, no! Bakugo yelled. It was a reckless, suicidal move. But it wasn't an attack. It was a distraction. The Nomu, a simple creature, turned its head, its body instinctively shifting to face the new, fast-moving threat. For 1/8 of a second, it exposed its back to All Might. That was all Izuku needed. All Might! He shrieked, his voice raw with desperation. It's back! The brain! All Might's eyes, grim and determined, met Izuku's for a split second. Understanding dawned. He had an opening. A target. A weakness. With a roar that was pure defiance, All Might broke the grapple. He moved faster than seemed possible, getting behind the still-turning Nomu. He didn't just punch. He drove his fist like a piston into the back of the creature's skull, precisely where Izuku's borrowed knowledge had told him to strike. The Nomu convulsed, its shock absorption failing against the direct, targeted blow to its control center. All Might didn't stop. He unleashed a furious barrage, each punch a plus ultra strike, driving the creature back, and then up, launching it out of the USJ and into the sky. The battle was won. The remaining villains, including a furious Shigaraki, retreated through Kurojire's portal. The silence that fell over the dome was heavy, broken only by the groans of the injured and the relieved sobs of the students. In the aftermath, as the other teachers arrived and paramedics tended to the wounded, Class 1A huddled together. They were a cluster of shared trauma, finding comfort in their collective survival. They recounted their battles, praised each other's bravery, and worried over Aizawa and 13. Izuku stood slightly apart from them. He couldn't join in their relief. To him, the USJ was no longer a training facility. It was a fresh graveyard. His eyes swept over the plaza. He saw the spot where the desperate man had been crushed by his own ally. He saw the faint dusting of powder where the sycophant had been unmade by decay. He saw the pile of rubble where the scientist had bled out, gifting him the key to victory with his dying breath. He had not just survived the attack, he had absorbed its casualties. Aizawa, being carefully loaded onto a stretcher, his entire head wrapped in bandages, looked over and saw him. He couldn't see the boy's expression, but he felt the stillness radiating from him. It was an unnatural calm. All Might, his form steaming, his time nearly up, limped over to the boy. He placed a heavy hand on Izuku's shoulder. Young Midoriya. That was incredibly reckless. But your quick thinking, it saved me. It saved all of us. How did you know? Izuku looked up at his mentor. The adoration and awe that had once been in his eyes were gone. They were replaced by something deep, ancient, and weary. He had seen the fight not as a student, not even as a hero, but from the perspective of the dead. He had seen the villains not as a monolith, but as desperate, pathetic, and in their own way, tragic figures. He had felt the horrifying touch of the true enemy. I just saw an opening, Izuku said, his voice flat. It was the only explanation he could give. The only one they would ever understand. All Might looked into his successor's eyes and felt a profound sense of unease. He had chosen this boy for his heroic heart, for his spirit of self-sacrifice. He was seeing that spirit calcify into something else entirely. It was still heroic, but it was now laced with a cold pragmatism and a haunted stillness that was not natural for a boy his age. The unblinking eye of the USJ had seen it all, and its gaze now looked out from behind the face of Izuku Midoriya. He was a hero, yes. But he was no longer just a boy. The week of internships was supposed to be a golden opportunity, a first taste of the professional hero world. For his classmates, it was a thrilling convergence of fantasy and reality. Uraraka was off to learn from the battle-oriented Gahead, while Bakugo, to his immense frustration, had been scouted by the fashion-forward best jeanist. For Izuku Midoriya, however, the choice was not his own. It was a directive from All Might, a piece of a legacy he was still struggling to understand. Gran Torino, All Might had said, his voice holding a tremor of what sounded suspiciously like fear. He was my predecessor's homeroom teacher, and mine for a time. He's retired now, but he knows more about One for All than anyone alive. He will whip you into shape. Izuku accepted with the same grim nod he now gave to most things. The fanba who would have vibrated with excitement at training with All Might's own teacher was buried under the weight of his mementos, notebook. He saw this not as an exciting adventure, but as a tactical necessity. He needed to control One for All. The clumsy, bone-shattering bursts were inefficient. To prevent death, he needed a weapon, not a self-destruct button. His body was the casing, One for All the warhead, and Gran Torino was the only engineer who could teach him how to build a proper fuse. Before leaving, he saw Tenya Ida by the station entrance. His friend stood ramrod straight, his expression a mask of cold, controlled fury. His chosen internship was in Hosa City, the very place his brother, the hero Ingenium, had been critically injured by the hero killer, Stain. Ida spoke of justice and honor, but Izuku, now an unwilling expert in the language of trauma and grief, saw something else. He saw a boy walking willingly into the fire, his armor of nobility barely concealing a suicidal desire for revenge. Ida, Izuku began, his voice low. Be careful. Hosa, it's not just about finding him. Ida's head snapped towards him, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. The hero killer is a stain upon our society, Midoriya. He must be brought to justice for what he did to my brother. It is my duty. Justice. The words felt hollow to Izuku. He had felt the last thoughts of the desperate and the unlucky. He knew the world wasn't so black and white. He saw the path Ida was on, and it ended in a dark alley. It ended with a new entry in his book, and that was a possibility he couldn't bear. Just don't let your duty get you killed, Izuku said, the words heavy with a wisdom Ida couldn't possibly understand. He was pleading with him, trying to prevent a future he could already feel taking shape. Ida simply gave a stiff, formal nod and marched towards his train, a soldier on his way to a battle he was destined to lose. Gran Torino's apartment was a cluttered, dusty hovel that smelled of old fish and ozone. The hero himself was a diminutive old man who seemed more senile than sagacious, at least until he moved. He moved like a ricocheting bullet, a yellow and white blur that sent Izuku crashing into walls and ceiling. The training was brutal. Gran Torino dismantled Izuku's perception of one for all. It wasn't something to be summoned into a limb for a single, explosive moment. It was a current, a power to be constantly circulated throughout the body. You're treating it like a special move, the old hero cackled, bouncing off a wall to deliver a sharp kick to Izuku's spine. It's not. It's a part of you. Let it flow. All the time. At 5%, the concept clicked with a painful, sudden clarity. Constant flow. A fortress of power, not just a cannon. An ever-present shield against the world. He practiced relentlessly, his body screaming in protest. While Gran Torino saw a determined student finally grasping a key concept, he didn't see the true motivation. Every jolt of pain, every muscle fiber that tore and rebuilt itself, was Izuku's penance and his preparation. He was building a better vessel, a stronger receiver, hoping that if, when, the next wave of death came, he wouldn't break. His progress was unnervingly fast. The grim focus that so concerned All Might served him well here. He didn't have the mental space for hesitation or self-doubt. The ghosts in his head demanded competence. He mastered 5% full calling in 2 days, a feat that left Gran Torino silently impressed and vaguely unsettled. The boy didn't have the fire of Tashinori. He had the cold, unyielding pressure of the deep ocean. Their patrol through Hosa was meant to be a practical application of his new skill. They were on a bullet train, the cityscape a blur outside the window, when the world erupted into chaos. A screech of tortured metal, an explosion that ripped through the carriage wall. A pro-hero, one Izuku vaguely recognized, was thrown through the train like a ragdoll, landing in a heap, and then a Nomu, different from the one at the USJ but just as monstrous, clawed its way inside. It had reptilian skin and grotesque, feathered wings. Panic flared. The screams of civilians were a familiar, dreaded chorus. Gran Torino leaped into action, a yellow bolt of righteous fury. But Izuku's attention was split. His quirk was humming, a low-grade psychic static that meant a life was teetering on the edge. The pro-hero who'd been thrown, he wasn't moving. Izuku was too far away for the full echo, but he could feel the life dimming, a fading ember in the storm. His phone buzzed. A mass text from Uraraka. A string of numbers. A location pin. Hosa City. His blood ran cold. He knew, with absolute, soul-crushing certainty, what it was. Ida. He had found Stain. He had sent his location not as a call for help, but as a pin on his own future grave, a message for someone to find his body. I have to go! Izuku yelled to Gran Torino over the roar of the wind and the Noma's screeching. He didn't wait for permission. He leaped from the gaping hole in the train, one for all 5% thrumming through his veins. He landed on a rooftop, the impact jarring but his legs holding firm. Hosu was on fire. Smoke plumed into the night sky from 3 different locations. The city was a war zone. More nomas swooped through the air, their cries echoing between the buildings. For a normal person, it was chaos. For Izuku, it was a sensory nightmare. The potential for death was everywhere. The air was thick with it, a psychic smog that choked him. He followed the pin on his phone, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He vaulted across rooftops, his movements fluid and efficient. He wasn't the clumsy boy from the USJ, he was a weapon now, honed by a grim purpose. He prayed he wouldn't be too late. He prayed he wouldn't have to feel his friend die. He found the alley. It was exactly as he had pictured it. Dark, narrow, smelling of refuse and blood. Ida was on the ground, his armor pierced, blood pooling beneath him. He was paralyzed, his eyes wide with helpless rage. Standing over him, sword drawn, was the hero killer, Stain, a man wrapped in rags and blades, his unnervingly long tongue darting out to lick the blood from his knife. And next to Ida, leaning against the damp brick wall, was another pro-hero, native, bleeding profusely from multiple wounds. Izuku landed at the mouth of the alley, a silent green blur. Stain's head snapped up, his reptilian eyes fixing on the newcomer. Another fake. Stain hissed, his voice a low, guttural rasp. This alley is a popular spot for them tonight. Izuku ignored him. His gaze was locked on native. The hero's breathing was shallow, a faint, wet rattle. He was fading. The psychic static in Izuku's head crescendoed, and he braced himself for the inevitable impact. The wave hit him. It wasn't a sudden shock, but a cold, creeping tide. He felt the life draining out of him, the spreading numbness of exsanguination. The world grew dim, his own body feeling heavy and useless. It was a slow, agonizing surrender, the feeling of a bastion being overrun. With the sensation came the final thought, and it was a revelation. It wasn't fear. It wasn't a plea for his own life. It was a moment of profound, soul-crushing shame, the final assessment of a life dedicated to a failed ideal. My failure, my weakness, it will be a stain on Hero's society. He was right about me. The thought was imbued with a lifetime of earnest belief in the concept of heroes, and the symbol they were meant to be. Native hadn't died fearing the villain. He had died believing he had proven the villain's ideology correct. He had failed the uniform. He had failed the title of hero. The agony of that failure was sharper than any of Stain's blades. The echo receded, leaving Izuku standing there, his heart a block of ice in his chest. He looked at Stain, the man who had just killed a hero, and for the first time, he understood. He didn't agree, but through Native's dying eyes, he understood the searing critique Stain represented. He understood the kernel of truth around which the hero killer had wrapped his bloody fanaticism. You! Izuku breathed, his voice dangerously low. A hero's job is to save people. Not to be judged by you. He launched himself forward, a green thunderbolt. 5% Detroit smash. The punch was aimed not to maim, but to disarm, to create distance. Stain, however, moved with a horrifying, arachnidan grace. He dodged, his sword flashing. It nicked Izuku's arm, a shallow cut, but it was enough. Stain's tongue lashed out, tasting the blood. Izuku's body seized up. He crashed to the ground, paralyzed, every muscle locked. You have the eyes of a true hero, Stain mused, looming over him. Like All Might. But you are still a child, meddling where you don't belong. I will kill your friend first, then the other, then I will deal with you. As Stain raised his sword over Ida, a new sound filled the alley. A monstrous shriek from above. The winged Nomu from the train, its hides smoking from Gran Torino's attacks, swooped down into the narrow space. Its dead eyes fixed on Stain, its programming identifying him as the most immediate threat. Stain's reaction was not fear, but pure, unadulterated disgust. This mockery of life. It has no conviction. No purpose. It is a tool. An animal. It is the very thing I despise. The Noma lunged, its claws extended. Stain moved in a flash. He threw a knife that embedded itself in the creature's exposed brain, then used the momentum of its lunge to slide under it. his katana slicing upwards in a clean, brutal arc that severed its spinal column. The creature crashed to the ground, twitching, its life blinking out. It died less than 10 feet from Izuku, and the second wave hit him. It was nothing like the others. It was utterly, terrifyingly alien. There was no sensation of pain in the conventional sense, just a blinding flash of psychic static, like a television screen losing its signal. There was no life flashing before its eyes, no coherent thought, no memory of a loved one or a cherished moment. There was only a chaotic jumble of sensory data, the feeling of falling, the smell of blood, the sound of a blade, all of it meaningless, without context. It was pain without a mind to process it, confusion without a self to be confused. And beneath that chaos, like a line of code embedded in its very being, was a single, overriding, psychic brand. A command that was its entire existence. It wasn't a word he heard, but a concept he felt, a shackle on a soul that might never have been a soul at all. Obey. The command was absolute, the sole pillar of the creature's reality. And in its final moment, as that pillar crumbled, there was only the psychic scream of a system crashing, of a slave being disconnected from its master. The echo was not of a life ending, but of a program being terminated. The paralysis wore off. Izuku gasped, scrambling to his feet, his mind reeling from the twin impacts. He now carried the shame of a fallen hero and the psychic shriek of a manufactured slave. He looked at the dead Nomu, then at Stain, and saw the two horrifying poles of the world he was fighting in. On one side, a fanatical ideology that would butcher good men for not being perfect. On the other, a shadowy evil that created soulless monsters, stripping away the very concept of life. Midoriya! Get up! A wave of ice shot down the alley, encasing Stain's feet. Shoto Todoroki had arrived, his left side wreathed in flame, his right smoking with frost. Sending your location to everyone, Midoriya? You're not very subtle, Todoroki said, his voice calm despite the carnage. The battle that followed was a desperate, chaotic dance. Todoroki's ice and fire provided range and control, while Izuku, now armed with a terrifying new understanding, became the close-quarters shock trooper. He was no longer just fighting to save Ida. He was fighting to honor natives' dying wish for a better hero society, a society that didn't need a monster like Stain to cull it. He was fighting against the unseen master who had branded the Nomu, the true all-for-one evil lurking in the shadows. Why are you all getting in my way? Stain roared, dodging a blast of fire and parrying a blow from Izuku. The fakes must be purged. Only true heroes, like All Might, deserve to stand. This society, overrun with phonies who chase money and fame, must be cleansed. Every word was a poisoned dart that found its mark in the fresh wound of natives' echo. Izuku felt the truth in the accusation, filtered through the shame of the dead hero. He knew there were heroes motivated by greed. But he also knew Native had died trying to save someone, a fundamentally heroic act, regardless of his ranking or public image. You're not the one who gets to decide! Izuku yelled back, his voice cracking with emotion. He dodged under Stain's blade, his full cowling-powered fist striking the villain in the ribs with a sickening crunch. Heroes save people! That's all that matters! They try! Even if they fail, even if they're not perfect, they put their lives on the line. You don't get to be the judge. He was fighting with a ferocity that surprised Todoroki. This wasn't the hesitant, self-destructive Midoriya from the sports festival. This was someone else. Someone older. Someone angrier. Working together, they overwhelmed him. Todoroki's fire forced him to dodge into a kick from a newly recovered Ida, and Izuku, channeling everything he had, delivered a final, decisive 5% Detroit smash that sent the hero killer crashing into a brick wall, knocking him unconscious. It was over. They stood there, breathing heavily, surrounded by blood, ice, and the bodies of a hero and a monster. The silence was broken by the arrival of Gran Torino and a squad of other pro-heroes. As they restrained the unconscious Stain, something happened. The villain's eyes snapped open. He rose to his feet, the combined killing intent of a lifetime of righteous slaughter washing over the alley. It was a physical force, a wave of pure, unshakable conviction that paralyzed everyone. Pro-heroes, veterans of 100 battles, froze in terror. Izuku felt it not as fear, but as another psychic phenomenon. It was the polar opposite of the Nomu's obey. It was an absolute, terrifying declaration of self. I am right. It was the will of a single man, forged into a weapon as potent as any quirk. You fakes! Stain growled, his voice a death rattle. I am the one who will create a more just world. He took a step forward, and then collapsed, a trickle of blood escaping his lips. A broken rib had punctured his lung. In the back of the ambulance, the three boys were a mess of bandages and exhaustion. Ida was weeping, apologizing for his foolishness. Todoroki was silent, his gaze distant. Izuku was the quietest of all. He stared out the window at the flashing lights of Hosu, the city's reflections sliding across his haunted eyes. He had won. He had saved his friend. But there was no victory, only weight. He now carried two new ghosts. He carried the shame of a good man who died believing he was a failure, and he carried the silent, obedient shriek of a creature that never had a chance to live. The line between hero and villain, once a bright, clear division in his mind, was now a chaotic, bloody blur. He understood that conviction, the very thing that drove heroes like All Might, could curdle into a fanaticism that was just as monstrous as the soulless creatures it claimed to oppose. He had been stained by the encounter, left immeasurably wiser, and terrifyingly darker. The Mementos notebook was waiting for him, and two more entries were ready to be written. The aftermath of the Hosu incident was a storm of managed information. To the public, the narrative was clean, simple, and heroic. Endeavor, the number 2 hero, had arrived in the nick of time to defeat the infamous hero killer, Stain, with the aid of a few other pros. The 3 UA students caught in the crossfire were lauded for their survival and bravery, but their direct role in Stain's capture was officially erased, buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements and stern lectures from Hosu's police chief. For Izuku Midoriya, the lie was a strange, hollow comfort. It kept the spotlight off him, allowing him to retreat back into the relative anonymity of Class 1A. But it was also a profound source of dissonance. He had been there. He had felt natives dying shame. He had absorbed the psychic shriek of the Nomu. The world celebrated a story, while he was haunted by the truth. Back in the familiar rhythm of UA, the change in him was becoming undeniable. It was subtle, a collection of small aberrations that, when pieced together, painted a deeply unsettling portrait. His friends, buoyed by the relief of his survival, noticed it first. Hey Deku, you okay? Uraraka asked one afternoon in the bustling cafeteria. She tilted her head, her round face etched with genuine concern. You've been quiet. Even for you. Izuku started, his fork clattering against his tray. He had been staring at the chaotic crowd of students, but he hadn't been seeing them. He had been scanning, his gaze flicking from face to face, subconsciously assessing, cataloging, a low-level hum of hypervigilance that had become his new normal. He was a lifeguard watching an ocean, knowing that at any moment, someone could slip beneath the waves. Oh! Yeah, I'm fine, Uraraka, he stammered, forcing a smile that felt like a mask. Just a lot on my mind. The internships were intense. Intense is one word for it. Ida chopped the air with his hand, though his movements lacked their usual crisp precision. He was more subdued now, the arrogant fire in his eyes replaced by a deep, sober gratitude. I owe you and Todoroki everything. My actions were impulsive and dishonorable. I nearly paid the ultimate price. We're just glad you're okay, man, Kirishima said, joining them with a tray piled high. A sudden clatter from the kitchen made a nearby student jump and drop their tray with a loud crash. Everyone flinched. But Izuku's reaction was different. He didn't just jump. His entire body went rigid, his hands slamming down on the table, his eyes wide and unfocused, pupils blown wide. For a split second, he wasn't in the UA cafeteria. He was back in a dark alley, the shriek of a Nomu in his ears, the scent of blood in the air. The sensation passed in a heartbeat, but it left him trembling, his knuckles white. His friends stared at him, their cheerful conversation dead. Midoriya? Todoroki's voice was a low rumble, his heterochromatic eyes sharp with observation. Izuku shook his head, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Sorry. Loud noise. He tried to laugh it off, a wretched, strangled sound. Guess I'm still a little on edge. They let it go, but the moment hung in the air. Uraraka saw the deep, weary shadows under his eyes, the way he seemed to be looking at something far away, even when he was looking right at her. She saw the haunted stillness that had settled over him since the USJ, now deeper and more pronounced. They were the eyes of an old soldier, not a 15-year-old boy. The change wasn't just social. It was academic. And that's where it drew the attention of the faculty. Shota Aizawa prided himself on his perception. As an underground hero and a teacher, his survival and the survival of his students depended on his ability to see what others missed. And what he was seeing from his most problematic student was beginning to defy all logical explanation. He sat in the faculty lounge late one evening, a cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. The room was quiet, most of the other teachers having gone home. Spread before him on the polished table were two documents. On the left was Midoriya's official psychological evaluation, mandated for all 3 students involved in the Hosu incident. The report was a sea of red flags. Subject displays classic symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Hypervigilance. Exaggerated startle response. Significant emotional detachment and anhedonia. Avoidance behaviors noted. Subject appears to be carrying a psychological burden far exceeding the reported trauma of the single event. On the right was Midoriya's after-action report, a requirement for any student involved in a major villain encounter. Aizawa had read it 3 times. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. It wasn't written like a student's recollection. It was a professional intelligence analysis. The breakdown of Stain's fighting style was meticulous, but it went beyond simple quirk analysis. The subject, Stain, operates on a rigid, self-defined ideological framework. Midoriya had written, his handwriting neat but severe. His movements are not purely tactical, they are expressive. He seeks not just to incapacitate, but to symbolically dominate his opponent, exposing their perceived hypocrisy. This makes him vulnerable to feints that challenge his philosophy rather than his physical person. He can be drawn into overextension by actions he deems truly heroic, as this paradoxically validates his worldview even as it creates an opening. And then there was the analysis of the Nomu. The creature designated Nomu exhibited no signs of self-preservation or higher cognitive function. Its movements were purely reactive, driven by a simple threat assessment hierarchy. Its lack of pain response suggests a severed or bypassed limbic system. The audible shriek upon its death was inconsistent with a biological entity, bearing more resemblance to a system failure or signal interruption. It is my assessment that this was not a living creature in the conventional sense, but a bioengineered weapon, remotely piloted or operating on a preset program. The master of this creature is the true threat. Aizawa leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. This wasn't the analysis of a hero fanboy. This was the cold, detached insight of a profiler, a strategist, someone who understood the psychology of his opponents on an intimate, almost unnatural level. He remembered the USJ. He remembered the boy's desperate, out-of-place scream. It's back! The brain! It had seemed like a lucky guess at the time, a moment of battlefield inspiration. But now, coupled with this report, it felt like something else. It felt like impossible knowledge. A quiet footstep made him look up. Toshinori Yagi, in his skeletal form, stood in the doorway, a worried look on his gaunt face. Still here, Aizawa? Reading this, Aizawa said, tapping the report. Midoriya's. Toshinori walked over, his eyes scanning the pages. He frowned. It's very detailed. It's more than detailed, Toshinori, Aizawa said, his voice flat. It's impossible. How does a 15-year-old kid who's had his quirk for a few months develop this level of psychological insight? This isn't something you learn from watching hero fights on the internet. This is something you learn from experience. Decades of it. Or, he trailed off, his gaze growing dark. From trauma that fundamentally rewires a person's brain. The psych report says he's suffering. This report shows he's using that suffering as a weapon. It's a dangerous combination. He's a good boy, Toshinori insisted, his voice soft but defensive. He has a heroic heart. He had a heroic heart, Aizawa corrected grimly. Now he has a black box. Something happened to that boy, Tashinori. Something before the USJ. Something that has been festering inside him. We can't keep ignoring it. For his own safety, we have to open it up. Tashinori sighed, the sound heavy with a mentor's guilt. You're right. Principal Nizu agrees. We'll talk to him tomorrow. The summons came the next day, after the final bell. As his classmates chattered and packed their bags, Aizawa appeared at Izuku's desk, a silent, imposing figure. Midoriya. The principal wants to see you. Now, the words dropped like stones into the cheerful atmosphere. Every head turned. Izuku felt a familiar spike of dread, cold and sharp. He nodded numbly, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He followed Aizawa out of the classroom, the concerned gazes of Uraraka and Ida burning into his back. The walk to the principal's office was silent. Aizawa didn't offer any explanation, and Izuku didn't ask. He just walked, his mind racing. What did they find out? Did they talk to the Hosa police? Is it about my fight with Stain? But deep down, a colder, more terrifying possibility gnawed at him. This felt different. This felt like an interrogation. The principal's office was a wide, airy room with a massive window that offered a panoramic view of the UA grounds. Principal Nizu, a creature whose species was a mystery but whose intelligence was legendary, sat behind his large desk, paws neatly folded. He was smiling, but his beady black eyes held no warmth. They were analytical, piercing, as if they could see right through flesh and bone to the secrets hiding within. And sitting on a plush couch to the side, looking more like a worried scarecrow than the former symbol of peace, was Tashinori Yagi. This was not a simple reprimand. This was an inquisition. Ah, Midoriya, thank you for coming, Nizu chirped, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. Please, have a seat. Would you care for some tea? And no, thank you, sir, Izuku mumbled, his throat dry. He sat down, the leather of the chair cool against his back. He placed his hands on his knees to stop them from shaking. The room was silent for a long moment, a calculated pressure. Aizawa stood by the door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Nizu slid the two reports across the desk. The psych evaluation and his after-action report. We have been reviewing the events of the Hosu incident. The principal began, his tone light and conversational. And your performance, while officially unrecorded, was by all accounts extraordinary. Your grasp of strategy, in particular, is astounding for a student your age. Izuku said nothing. It was a baited hook. Aizawa spoke up from the door, his voice cutting through the quiet. Your report on Stain's psychological state was more insightful than the one we received from the professional profilers. You pegged him as an ideologue, not a simple serial killer. That's a key distinction. How did you know that? Izuku's mind flashed back to the alley. He felt the cold tide of natives' dying shame, the agony of a hero who died believing his killer was right. My failure will be a stain on Hero's society. That's how he knew. Stain hadn't just killed Native, he had converted him in his final moment. I read a lot, Izuku stammered, falling back on his old identity. I've analyzed heroes and villains for years. It was an educated guess, Aizawa repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. And the Nomu? You described its death as a system failure. You theorized it was a bioweapon. That's a conclusion our own RD department took 2 days to reach after a full autopsy. How did you guess that? The memory of the Nomu's end was a screech of static in his head. The feeling of a program being terminated. The psychic brand of obey. It didn't feel alive, he said, the words tasting like ash. When it fell, it just stopped. There was no life in its eyes. A lot of villains lack life in their eyes, kid, Aizawa said, taking a step into the room. That's not enough to base a full systems analysis on. He stopped in front of the desk, leaning his hands on it, his gaze boring into Izuku. Let's go back further. The USJ. The Nomu there had shock absorption. It was taking blows from All Might himself without flinching. And yet you knew its weakness. You screamed for All Might to hit the brain on its back. That wasn't a guess, Midoriya. It was specific, actionable intelligence. In the middle of a life-or-death battle, You knew its precise weak point. How? The trap had sprung. The walls were closing in. He could feel the phantom pressure of a dead scientist being crushed under concrete, the frantic, final thought gifting him the answer. Brain is exposed, weakest from the back. Processors, vulnerable from the back. He couldn't tell them. He couldn't say, "Oh, the ghost of its creator told me as he was dying." They would drag him from UA in a straitjacket. They would take one for all away. They would see him not as a hero, but as a ghoul, a monster who fed on death. The isolation he felt now would become a permanent, institutionalized reality. His dream, his new grim purpose, would be over. His voice was a bare whisper. His carefully constructed walls were crumbling. The pressure from Aizawa, the disappointed, worried gaze of All Might, the unnervingly intelligent stare of Principal Nizu, it was too much. "Young Midoriya," All Might said, his voice soft and pained. "We are not here to punish you. We are here to help. But we can't help you if you don't tell us the truth. The strain you are under, it is not healthy. It is breaking you. Please. What is it you are hiding?" The genuine concern in his mentor's voice was the final blow. A dam inside him broke. Tears he had been holding back for months, since the day he felt Kenji Tanaka drown in that underpass, welled up and spilled over, hot and shameful, down his cheeks. He hunched over in his chair, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The carefully maintained composure, the stoic mask of the haunted soldier, shattered into a million pieces, revealing the terrified, traumatized 15-year-old boy beneath. He cried for a long time, the only sound in the room his choked gasps. Aizawa's hard expression softened into something resembling pity. All Might looked like he was about to crumble into dust from sheer guilt. Nizu watched, his head tilted, his analytical gaze never wavering. Finally, the sobs subsided into ragged breaths. Izuku wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, looking up at them with red-rimmed, desperate eyes. He had to give them something, a piece of the truth, wrapped in a lie. "It's my quirk," he whispered, his voice raw. The three of them stiffened. "Your quirk is one for all," Aizawa stated, though it sounded like a question. My other quirk," Izuku clarified, the lie taking shape in his panicked mind. It was technically true. He did have another quirk. He had been born with it. "The one I was born with. I thought I was quirkless. It never did anything. Not until..." He trailed off, thinking of the sludge villain. "Not until recently." Nizu leaned forward, his interest piqued. "A late-blooming quirk? Or a secondary manifestation triggered by the introduction of one for all? Fascinating. Please, Midoriya, describe it." Here was the tightrope. He had to describe its effects without revealing its cause. I don't know what to call it," he said, choosing his words with agonizing care. "It's an information-gathering quirk. It only activates in intense situations, when things are at their absolute worst. When someone is in extreme danger, or when everything is falling apart." He looked at Aizawa, then at All Might. "At the USJ, when that Noma was hurting Mr. Aizawa, when All Might was fighting for his life, it happened. I get flashes. Information. I don't know where it comes from, it just appears in my head. Tactical data, weak points, psychological states. It's too much. It feels like having 100 news reports screaming in my head at once. It's overwhelming." He clutched his head, the memory of the sensory overload, the pain of the echoes, giving his performance a terrifying verisimilitude. "In Hosu, it was the same," he continued, his voice trembling. "With Stain, with the Noma. It's like I can see the code behind the chaos. But it takes a toll. It leaves me, like this." He gestured vaguely to his own shaking form. "It's a burden. It's too much information." The faculty lounge was silent once more. The three teachers exchanged glances, processing the bombshell. A secondary, high-stress activated, psychic intelligence quirk. In a world of explosive sweat and talking to animals, it was bizarre, but it was plausible. It explained his impossible knowledge. It explained the PTSD. It explained the haunted look in his eyes. Almost. All Might was the first to react, his guilt overwhelming him. He had chosen this boy, thinking he was a blank slate, a pure-hearted vessel, to learn that the boy was already cursed with a quirk that fed on trauma, a quirk that was likely exacerbated by the high-stakes world he had thrust him into. It was a devastating blow. "My boy," Toshinori whispered, his voice thick with remorse. "I had no idea." Aizawa's expression was complex. He was a pragmatist. The story fit the facts, but his instincts, honed by years of underground work, told him something was still missing. The depth of the boy's trauma felt deeper than just too much information. The way he had described it felt like he was describing the symptoms, not the disease. But he was looking at a student who had just broken down, who had confessed to a secret that was clearly destroying him. Pushing further now would be cruel and counterproductive. "This quirk," Aizawa said, his voice softer than Izuku had ever heard it. "Does it cause you physical pain?" "Sometimes," Izuku answered truthfully. "It's more a psychic pain." "An echo." The word slipped out before he could stop it. Nisa seized on it. "An echo? Fascinating. As if you are experiencing a resonance of the event itself. A quirk like this would require immediate and ongoing psychiatric support. We have the best counselors in the country. Hound Dog can see you tomorrow. We will also need to add this to your official quirk registry," Aizawa added. "We'll classify it as high-stress analysis for now. We need to understand its limits, its triggers, its backlash. We need to help you control it, or it will consume you." Izuku just nodded, a wave of hollow relief washing over him. They believed him. They bought the lie. He was safe. "You are dismissed, Midoriya," Nisa said, his smile returning, though it seemed more clinical than ever. "Get some rest. You have endured a great deal. Know that you are not alone in this. The faculty of UA is here to support you." Izuku stumbled out of the office, his legs feeling like lead. He walked down the empty corridor, the setting sun casting long, lonely shadows on the polished floor. The immediate pressure was gone. He had an alibi for his ghosts. He had a name for his curse, even if it was a false one. But as he walked, the relief curdled into a deeper, more profound sense of isolation. He had built a new, more elaborate wall between himself and the very people who were trying to help. He had invited them into a single, carefully curated room of his haunted house, while locking the doors to all the others, where the real horrors resided. They thought they understood his burden. They had no idea. They didn't know about the library of sorrows in his head, about the quiet last whispers of the dead he carried with him every second of every day. They were offering him a life raft, not knowing he was already chained to an anchor at the bottom of the sea. He was more alone now than he had ever been. He had his secrets, and his secrets had him.